Hello, I'm Joyce Woodworth. Welcome to the Spirit of Winona. Today we're at the St. Mary's Toner Center, where there is currently on display a wonderful collection of group portraits and scenes from our past. These pictures have been compiled by a woman who has a passion for telling the stories of the old settlers depicted here. We're going to meet with her today and hear some of the stories and find out how the Old Settler Society keeps our history alive. We're standing with Mary Nilles inside the Toner Center by all these wonderful photographs of our old settlers. And Mary Nilles is the person who has a real passion for telling the story about these settlers. Hi, Mary.
Hi.
Welcome to the Spirit of Winona, Mary. And tell me, first off, about yourself and how you got so interested in these old people.
Okay, glad to do. I was born in Rolling Stone, Minnesota, and grew up there in a house that had in its middle a log cabin. That's claim number one to interest in territorial Minnesota. Secondly, I went from Winona, St. Teresa's in those days, out to New York City, New York University, and I went to study. And one of the things I was interested in my graduate studies was Winona County history. And subsequently, I had various grants, and I published several books on the history of Rolling Stone, in particular Luxembourger immigration. At that time, I did not know, and I had never seen, this fabulous collection called the Photo Collection of the Old Settlers Association. But once I saw it, I said, this is a fabulous treasure, so I began to look at it in addition to just the Western Farm. So here we see, for example, in beginnings, some of the key persons who helped form the territory of Winona territorial history. On the wall, if I can look at them here, are people like, of course, Orrin Smith. We all know about Mr. Smith, makes the first claim on the site of Winona, October 15th, 1851. But above him is someone that we might not know as well, Nathan Brown, who goes down to Homer and Dakota. He's an Indian trader. He can speak to the Native Americans in the area, and certainly is an important person in developing that early period. Here is his wife, a Miss Bartholomew, whom he marries in Milwaukee and brings her to his wonderful log house in Dakota. In addition, we have persons like James Reed, the Indian trader who's at Tremplow. Here's John Bunnell of Bunnell House fame. These are persons who are here in that very early period, the late 40s into the early 50s. These Western Farm and Village people were organized by someone from New York State, a man named William Haddock, in July of 1851. And their purpose was to form a utopian colony on public lands in the West. And the West turned out to be Winona County, Minnesota. People like E.B. Drew became quite famous. A fabulous farmer from western part of New York State. He's called often the first farmer of the Rolling Stone Valley. He meets the Indians, offers them a barrel of flour, tries to keep peace. Remember, 1851-52, these individuals are in Minnesota territory, not the state. And so the Native Americans say, you're on my land, please leave or pay me something. So E.B. Drew becomes quite recognized. He's a leader in politics, in education, And he's also wonderful because he and his wife leave us written records. There are wonderful E.B. Drew papers. He keeps a diary and details for us his early life in Minnesota City, Rolling Stone Valley. These are panels, composite board, to which have been nailed any number of photos ranging from, on some panels, 10, on other panels, as many as 30, individual photographs. And I found these panels put together in 6 huge coffin-like boxes in the Pickwick Mill.
Tell me a little bit more about that. Is that where you got most of these pictures?
Yes. I had learned from reading the Winona paper and from speaking to certain members of the old settlers, including Opal Fitch, at the mill, that these pictures were there in the boxes, but I had no index. Evidently, the index burned up in the Redmonds fire of the early 60s. Photographs were put here in an order that is unknown to me. That is, on one panel we have a mix. Here, for example, we have the courthouse gang of 1900 with a man who appears to be cutting grass with a black crow sitting on his grass collector. And then we switch to Civil War veterans. So it's all quite mysterious as to why on a certain day someone would have nailed this together. The good news is they're nailed down and we haven't lost them. Got the first permission, I think it was in late August of 2 years ago, to go to the mill, and I opened the boxes, and there I saw all of these mothers and fathers and children and dogs and farm scenes and businesses and streets. I had never seen such a collection, and a collection that included the whole county. A job to be done. Like the Bible says, gather up the fragments lest they be lost, right? This is our history. These are our founding fathers and moms. And kids and dogs and street scenes, and it's all here in 6 boxes. So here is a sample. This is my designation because I've created an index to the collection as I found it 2 years ago. I photographed the collection, and I videotaped it and I photographed it just here the best I could, and then I created this system. Here we have Daniel O'Brien Lumber. So we have Mr. O'Brien and his wife, and this is a photo from probably the 20s. But here we have a Rissinger, and here we have someone who's definitely from the 1880s, and here we have Kate Berry, and Kate Berry is the daughter. We have her in the show. Kate Berry was the beautiful, beautiful daughter of a lawyer in town in the 1870s and 80s. This is a photo from the 1870s. She's a dressmaker. Next to her, we have Mrs. Stockton, as in the town of Stockton. And here we have an orchestra, and this is interesting because someone has identified the members of that orchestra. And here we have a river scene. This is a picture of the Slade Block, and we know it today as the corner of Main and 3rd Street. It's a much photographed building, and it's one of the street scenes in this collection. What is also interesting in this collection is that we see photos of buildings that are extremely old, or the individuals who owned or worked in the building are actually in the doorway. That's the case here, where we see the Petted Drugstore. The Pet Drugstore, location west side of Center between 3rd and 4th, approximately 1890. is a collection of people who, for the most part, dealt with education. And it's so valuable and interesting because on one panel we have Professor von Rohr. He's a minister. Von Rohr teaches German at the early Winona State. These people helped build the educational system. Here's Professor Phelps, as in Phelps Hall. So when they were asked to donate their photo, interesting that they might choose when they were young, handsome, virile people, as opposed to, or in addition to their photos when they were much older.
The Old Settlers Society began in the 1860s, with the main focus being to preserve the history of the local people. They met once a year to catch up with the happenings of Winona County, and in the late 1800s, they passed a resolution that all members have their photograph taken. Bob Bamanick, the current president of the still active Old Settlers Society, tells us more.
Photography at that time was kind of like the modern invention, and so they wanted to make use of that and took pictures of the members, and they were going to preserve those pictures for the future, and that included displaying them at future annual meetings.
What's happening with them today?
They're still very active. In fact, in February, we just had our 115th annual meeting. In preserving our history, focus on some area of Winona County each year, and we still do a presentation of the history of that area, and that includes mentioning some of the people that you see displayed here. To be a registered member of the Winona County Old Settlers, you are to have lived in Winona County for 31 years. We do have a group of people that will not join because they do not want to be associated with the word old. Mm-hmm. And our board and our membership have talked at length about this. And one of the proposals is that we simply become the Winona Settlers and just drop old. And, that doesn't really reflect the group. And then we have a group of the people there that say, old, we all get there someday, and it's just a matter of your perception about that. We don't dwell on that. We're the Winona County Settlers, and what we share among all of us is some part in the history of Winona. And today, getting together, preserving that, talking about it, giving people the opportunity to share experiences, and providing some entertainment. Our day of the annual meeting is one where there's lots of entertainment. Sometimes it's school kids that come and entertain. Other times we have almost professional entertainers with us. And there's lots of attendance prizes. There's a very nice meal and an opportunity for people to do some old-time dancing if they like, reminiscing, and sharing some of the history of Winona County.
Well, sounds great, and thanks for keeping it alive.
Okay. Well, Joyce, we're expecting to see you next year.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you very much.
On this panel, we have some of the oldest pictures in the collection, and they happen to be of men who served in the Civil War. A very moving portrait, I think, of Joseph Perriam. He leaves Winona, goes off, has this picture taken, and about 6 months later he dies at Gettysburg. So we know that this picture we believe it to be an original, not a copy of a previous picture. Here's a case where we see Colonel John Ball. Look at him, the very young John Ball. His picture appears in many different forms. We have the John Ball Post in Winona. Some of them have their pictures taken later as older men. You can notice here these are old gentlemen who are posing. This man poses near the flag. We have a range of photos taken from 1862 till probably 20 years later.
And there's the ladies up there watching them going off, right?
Yes.
Going off to war.
Going off to war.
This is Bill Krueger, who is a Civil War history buff, aren't you, Bill?
Yes, I am.
And now this collection, I'm sure, brought up many, many memories for you. But tell me about the pictures that we have right here on display.
Winona County's part of the Civil War is very significant. 860 men from Winona County served in the Civil War. You've got to remember, Minnesota became a state in 1858. The war started in 1861, so it was a new experience. Of the age group between 17 and 35, which is the eligible age to serve in the Army, 35% of that group served, which is very high in national statistics. Winona and Minnesota played a very important part. The other thing is that we're in the group here of the 1st Regiment. There were 11 Minnesota regiments. There were also a couple of cavalry brigades. There were some artillery groups as well. But the 1st Regiment is the most famous of all of them. It was famous because on the second day of Gettysburg, it turned the tide of battle. It was one of the regiments. There were a number of them that did this. That 3 days in that 3 days battle, but they were at the right place at the right time. There were 289 of them that stopped a charge of 1,500 Southerners and prevented the Southerners from outflanking the Union line.
Okay.
And so that saved the day. And that was a critical battle of the Civil War. And unfortunately, of those 289, only 47 survived.
Now you have a little story about some of these people. Yeah. Tell me what you have.
The first captain was Captain Lester, Henry Lester over here, and he was a lawyer, local lawyer, and he formed the company. The 3rd commander is Captain Joseph Perriam, who was the 2nd richest man in Winona. Was an excellent captain. He was killed at Gettysburg. Had a great rapport with all of the troops. David B. Dudley was a New Hampshire man, one of 5 New Hampshire men that fought in the Civil War in Winona. He was the 1st sergeant of the Company K. He was killed at Antietam. There was a young woman in New Hampshire who was in love with him, and she wrote to the company, and the succeeding 1st sergeant wrote back to her. And his name was Matthew Marvin. We know a lot about him. And eventually they carried on a 3-year correspondence and married. And she moved to Winona, and her husband became the superintendent of Woodlawn Cemetery. This is John Ball. He was the engineer that laid out the plat of Winona. And he joined. He was a sergeant when he joined. He ended up as a captain of a different regiment. And then he became the lieutenant colonel of the 3rd Regiment. So he ended the war as a colonel, unfortunately badly wounded. He died shortly after the war. But the John Ball Grand Army of the Republic group is named after him. There are 3 brothers, Durfee brothers. We have pictures of 2 of them. This is Chester, and that's George. Chester was only 15 years old when he joined. He lied about his age, as did a lot of other people. Both of these men survived the war. His brother Jason, unfortunately, was captured and died in a prison at Richmond, Virginia. Later on in life, both of these men went on and became pretty successful. Chester became the superintendent of schools in Cook County in northern Minnesota. And over 150 men from Winona County served in the 1st Regiment. And this wonderful collection has a group of them here. They don't have all of them, but they have a number of them.
James Wright, very important in the political life of Rolling Stone Township, is a township clerk more than 25 years. He's called Grandpa Wright and doing it right, much loved by the Minnesota City Winona crowd. Here we have O.M. Lord. He and his wife are honored specially in large frames because he also develops education on a statewide level. He's a politician, he's a farmer. He wins praise for his grapes, his plums, his apples, and his land is now, in fact, being developed. Some of his land is at present being developed by Mike Corcoran in Minnesota City. So his legacy lives on. Good old Egbert Chapman and his wife, born in England, they come to New York City. He drives a motor car up and down Broadway, has a home near the World Trade Center, formerly the World Trade Center's area, and then in 1951 he signs up to come to the public lands in the West and lives out his life in Rolling Stone Township. Robert Pike is a poet. He's a writer, a poet, West New York. He lives across the Hudson in New Jersey, writes little poems throughout his life. Some people think he's insane slightly. very eccentric, but in his obituary, he and his wife are praised for brilliance and foresight. And I look at his eyes and I think of what he must have seen or thought in Minnesota City in those first days. The Watermans were very educated. Some of these people had attended Harvard and Yale. They were very, they were lawyers. The Bannons again, people from England. And let's end with the Burleys from Vermont and Mr. Denman. Denman has a daughter who returns to New York City to become a physician, one of the first women physicians in the city, goes to the city hospitals, unfortunately dies of consumption in her late 20s. So lots of these people come from New York State, and maintain connections with New York throughout their lifetime.
Join me next week when Mary Nilles shows us the early fashions of the Winona people, the early work groups and jobs available then, the types of educational opportunities, the early scenes of the city, and here's some of the stories of Winona's more interesting characters from the 1800s. This has been Joyce Woodworth. Till then, enjoy the Spirit of Winona. Hello, this is Joyce Woodworth. Welcome to the Spirit of Winona. In last week's show, we discovered how Mary Nilles, a local historian, uncovered hundreds of old photos held by the Old Settlers Society. Along with the pictures which she had copied and framed and now displays in various shows throughout the county, she also has a story to tell about the photos, about the people and their lives, and what life was like in Winona way back at the turn of the century. Many of these photos have never been seen since they were stored away many years ago. In today's Part 2 story of the Old Settlers' history, we will look at the fashions, the working environment, the educational system, the architecture and street scenes of the Winona area from the 1860s to the 1920s. Mary, it looks like you have your whole collection categorized. Like now we're in the fashion. How did you go about deciding which categories to put together?
It wasn't easy. We had about 1,100 pictures to work with. Some of them were in very bad shape, so we didn't want to eliminate photos just because they were faded. We decided to balance parts of the county, balance age, balance good photos, beaten up photos, and decided we would go with generic classifications. I'm interested in fashion, and so fashion for men and women and children. Look at Lola Pickle. Mrs. Pickle is the wife of a Civil War hero, Alonzo Pickle, and she's wearing a fabulous hat with sequins. She's beautiful, fabulous face, beautiful bone structure, and many people have come in here saying she's a model, she's wonderful, and this is beauty in Winona.
She's pretty.
She's very pretty. Look at Alex. He is suited and booted. He's a young man, a teenager, and I love his little pinky ring. He's in his finest. Sadie Denman, hat, gloves. She's from that famous Denman family. Very early, Western Farm and Village, posed, and of course she's hanging on or leaning against this prop because in those days she had to remain still for maybe 1 or more minutes. Louise Worthington, fabulous, beautiful dress. She later marries, becomes a teacher, earns $20 a month. Kate Berry, what a gorgeous child. How beautiful her dress. Her father is the lawyer, C.H. Berry. He later becomes Attorney General for the state of Minnesota. Kate eventually marries his law partner, a Mr. Morey. Unfortunately, she too dies quite young. Mrs. Huff, Harriet, in her splendor, Harriet Carpenter Huff, also someone from New York State, marries Henry Huff. They have their wonderful experience in Winona, real estate, business. They move to Chicago, unfortunately lose a lot of their fortune in the fire, or shortly thereafter, but in old age she returns to live and die in Winona. We chose Mr. and Mrs. Gore because they gave us Gore's Valley or Pleasant Valley, and because they're early farmers and they're in their finest. They may not have good teeth, you see. Dental care was lacking for many people, but they're so lovely and they're so dignified. This picture we chose because they're young people. These are teenagers of 1877. We wanted to show how the shape of some of these photos, they're in terrible shape. They're faded, they're nailed down, but these guys stand against their props, have their photo taken, and they're with us today. They both went into business later in Winona. Fred Flint, looking terrific in high fashion of the day. Look at that ring and that tie. And finally, here is Mr. Wunder. John Wunder comes from Holstein, Germany, ends up a florist, and stands there with his gorgeous blossoms. And finally, Catherine Speltz. She represents high fashion of the immigrant crowd. She is a woman born in Contern, Luxembourg, a widow. She comes here with her 7 children. She's buried on Oak Ridge. And Morgan Yare does her picture. Notice this gorgeous cross. She's probably carrying her money on her neck and wearing an immigrant hat or something, whatever that's called.
Mary, now we're in your education section. Tell me how you divided this up and who's significant in this group.
Okay. Well, the significant persons are captured at summer vacation, so all the teachers are put into boxes so they cannot give assignments to students. Look at them here. Mm-hmm. These are some of the earliest teachers in Winona County. Of special interest to me is a woman who taught at the Winona Normal, and the Winona Normal opened in the fall of 1860. Miss Sheldon. She was rescued by Brother Roderick Robertson from her tintype, and we rescued her. Next to her are people like Ann Orton, Hester Hoke, who's out at Minnesota City, Miss Welch, Kate Stevens, and some of these people are in the class of 1874. We have the entire class of 74, and that's a wonderful, wonderful collection. From its members, there are several who became quite famous. Kate Berry, whom we saw over here as a beautiful little child, is now growing up. Her father is the lawyer, C.H. Berry. She later marries his law partner. Here we have Alhambra Deming. She goes on to work in the school system of Winona, and when she dies in 1930, she's on the front page. She gave 52 years of her life to education here and ended up, I think, 30 years a principal at what was then called the Washington School. We also can trace some of these. Ada Thompson, for example, when she gets married, her wedding is in the paper. We know what wedding gifts were given. She marries a man from New York State, and they rent a special car on the railroad and take Winona dignitaries with them as they go back to the east. Here's Miss Cone. She's the daughter of R.D. Cone. As he gets sick and ages, he turns over a lot of power to her. She's then a young married woman. Unfortunately, she too dies quite young, but she certainly had accomplished a great deal in the world of, she was a woman in business in Winona long before it became fashionable to have, coffee hours and teas to promote women in business. She did it. Have researched a number of them, and some of them went on and did great work in Winona area education.
What about the boards here? How is this related to education?
Well, we, again, notice that the pictures on the boards are an incredible collection, but we do have the Jackson School of 1870 over here. That's a wonderful shot, very faded, but we can rescue it with digital imaging. And then over here we have the Good Literature Club. Look at the ladies bringing their kids. So we have some intergenerational reading going on. And there is, of course, Mr. Maybury, the great C.G. Maybury and his extended family, and they were often involved in educational adventures. Here we have the Teachers Institute, April 1889. The Winona papers followed their progress as they met for a 2-3 day period. We know that one of the main topics was keeping the public schools healthy. Hygiene was on the minds of everyone. How to teach hygiene to all the kids. Disease control, disease prevention, as well as the basics.
Tell me a bit about this one here. This is a rather interesting shot. What does that have to do with education?
Well, it's the Good Literature Club, and we know that many people did not go beyond 8 grades. Some of the kids who were out in the country only went 6 years, and until quite recently, high school was, as far as anyone went. College was certainly not for everyone. So you could continue your education. Look at that group. If you were an elderly woman, you could pass on a love of reading or other interests to your daughter and their kids. So you see, this is women. It's a very interesting feminist photo, isn't it? Women passing on education and reading good literature. 1918, they sit above Lake Winona reading who knows what.
One other photo of particular interest included in the education display is a fun look at a group of local talent performing in the old Opera House, which is now a parking lot across from the Historical Society. This group from the early 1900s called themselves the Florodora Sextets, performing a scene from the gay 90s. Other photos in the collection related to education include a schoolmaster with his group of young boys in the 1870s, as well as the newest picture in the collection showing a group of parents ironically portraying old settlers for the Madison School PTA in 1940. How are these related to your work category?
Well, each of these photos includes, each of these is somebody who is involved in a certain profession. In the 1800s or turn of the century into the 1900s, someone who has in some way made a name for himself or herself. For example, here is Mr. Larson. He's a barber, and his photo is taken by Wiggins House of Art. That means he's coming out of perhaps the late 60s into the 70s. And here's the famous Jacob Story, who's very well educated. He's a lawyer, is in probate court. And here we have 2 great photos of the railroad repair shops on the west end of Winona.
In the collection related to work, is a photo of the employees in front of the Empire Lumber Company in 1894. In the same era, the employees of the Daily Republican Book Binding Company stand outside their building. Also included is a photo inside the Park Brewery and the truck drivers or haulers of the day waiting for their next load to be delivered from their horse and wagon. Also delivering, we can't forget the Iceman. Before refrigeration, he's the person who delivered chunks of ice from his horse and insulated wagon to every home and business that had an icebox to keep their food cold. Also included is the Winona Volunteer Fire Department from 1888, who would roll their hose to the fire either manually or by horse. However, they could be assured the fire chief would be there first as he speeded through the streets of Winona in his horse and carriage. Also included is a picture of the Turner Hose Company, which was connected to the fire department during that time, and the only requirement was that every worker have a mustache. The women of the day were working hard within the home, but also had their volunteer groups as well, such as the Ladies' Aid Society for St. Martin's Lutheran Church and this volunteer group for the Red Cross.
This is the grandfather, Jacob, of Butch Waltz, of Waltz Buick, and obviously they were in a wonderful butcher shop filled with goodies. Lots of carcasses here. They appear to be probably beef or huge turkeys also. Lots of antlers. And over here we have very best flour. A wonderful inviting photograph. Waltz Meat Market.
Jake Waltz was the immigrant who first came to Winona in the 1870s, opened Jake's Meat Market, and had 2 children, Norm and Jim, and a dog named Bismarck. Norm, also known as Butch, was the grandfather of the Butch Waltz who now owns Waltz Buick. Okay, what do we have here? Oh, I see Norton, a few
yes,
lumber people.
A few of these names are very well known to us. James Norton, a lumber magnate. Here's Charles Gurnis, connected to the Gurnis philanthropy on this campus. Jules Gurnis, of course, that's a relative of his. Here's an interesting photo collection. These are farmers, the Herbers. In terms of photography, this is interesting because the Mr. Theodore Herber was photographed by B.N. Rivers in Rolling Stone. And here is his wife. She's a Speltz. That is her mama over here on the wall. So many of these people are interconnected. But he died in the 1870s. So how could he have his photo taken by Mr. Rivers, who didn't open his photo shop, until 1898? She evidently had some picture, probably a tintype, brought it in. It was rephotographed so they could be partners in photography, though she had been a widow 20-something years. And the famous Charles Beck. Oh my goodness, here he is. And his house stands on the St. Mary's University campus. Beck was born in Germany, studied beer making, came here, took over the Gilmore Valley beer establishment just down the road, and then built his own brewery, which burned. Around the time, 1876, 1877, he built the famous Beck House, still standing on campus. Went on later into hardware on 3rd Street. William Wyndham. We saw his picture on our money. He became Secretary of the United States Secretary of the Treasury. And here's Bishop Cotter from England, comes here, an immigrant, and becomes the bishop of the Catholic diocese. Here's a farmer. He's at work, Mr. Reynolds, an African American in 1909 at work in Stockton. And moving quickly, Mrs. Laird connected with the lumber industry and philanthropy, our library. Here's J.B. Rivers. He has a store in Rolling Stone, and he is an example of someone who serves in the Civil War but is not part of Company K. Mr. Rivers served in a company out of Wisconsin. Mrs. Anger, a German, Holstein, Germany, and the Anger block still standing. Of course, she managed after her husband died. So we had a number of these very strong ladies who carried on, like, look at Margaret Simpson, the mother of social work in Winona, Margaret Simpson House, and R.D. Cohn, we know about him. Over here, very interesting gentleman, Mr. Story, a man called Professor Story, African-American gentleman, and there were so few African-Americans in Winona, so we mentioned race for that reason. Story was working the riverboats up and down the river, a great musician, and a German fellow, Professor Rollwaiter, asked him to come and join the Germania band, and they were quite a hit for a while. Later, he had a barber shop, but he was always called the Professor. The famous Willie Mitchell, lawyer, law school named after him. Yes, Buck, of course, of the famous Buck House, a lawyer.
The individuals in the collection became way too numerous to mention, so I selected some of the more charming ones to share with you. These are our ancestors dressed in their best for the Winonans of the 21st century. Have the groups. Okay, how did you pick all your groups?
Again, a hard decision, but we tried to take pictures that would include a number of important people, industries, businesses, and also that would be clear enough so that we could really see their faces. Example here, Central Police Station with Mayor Tarbell. Wonderful shot, and all of these people could be identified eventually, because we have records on who served during his reign. We switched to a farm. Here is a Waltz farm, as in Waltz Buick. We must give them a plug for a great farm scene, typical turn of the century, 1900, early 1900s, with, to the left, a pet elk. A bit unusual. Gorgeous photo, clear, lots of detail, people in period costume standing proudly in their farmyard. Not everyone had an elk. Here we are at the German, the Deutsche Apotheke, the apothecary, Mr. Lauer. And again, we can walk right in and see what he's got for sale. Very interesting details in that building, beautiful brickwork. Here's Watkins' main building being erected. And again, perhaps other shots of some of these pictures are around, but these are the ones that are in the collection. Not every street is mentioned, not every business, but some of these are especially clear. Automobile. These people actually created this thing, this car. Wonderful, isn't it? And then we go to the fire department. This is an interesting picture because people have come here to study, well, where is this building? And of course, to the left, we see the building that we know as Magnolias, Beano's, and this section here, if I point here, is of course gone. That's a parking lot. But this was the fire headquarters.
This particular photo is dated 1923. However, another picture exists in the collection from 1913, taken at the same spot on Lafayette Street between 3rd and 4th. At that time, the fire rigs were still pulled primarily by horses. However, this picture shows, I believe, Winona's very first gas-powered fire truck.
And some people know this, if you like a good glass now and then, high and low. The bar, Julius Keekbush Saloon, 529 West Wabasha. Great photo, lots of drama. People are in the upstairs windows, the Iceman has arrived, they're all out. Here comes a man with his team of horses covered with a fly catcher. It's a wonderful, clear, exciting image.
This has got a great shot of the old ice wagon that used to deliver the ice.
Wonderful, and the streets, of course, are unpaved. Look at this. And so you could write a novel about what's happening at this moment, who's in the window, who knows whom. It's just a wonderful, wonderful, exciting shot. Veterans coming back from the Spanish-American War. And the baseball team. A number of people have come here and have identified persons on this team. There are enough people living, and we could, if we put out a call for help, which we maybe should do with some of these photos to get them identified, that's the next step. Or get them on a website. Please help us identify these people. This is a fabulous photograph. The lath mill. Of course, the lumber industry created laths, strips of lumber. And some of these kids, look at them, they're children, some without shoes, in very old clothes. They're working with much older people in the back. And Brother Roderick Robertson from Art and Design loved this photo and others, but he loved this one so much that he wanted it to come alive. And so he created the mandala on the wall here, using some of these images and repeating them in that fabulous, colorful circle. So these are not just dead people, but we respect them, they come alive, and they are like us, and we can recreate them with new technology in new formats, like that mandala.
Now, Mary, this last wall here has a number of photographs on it. You have 1,100 altogether in your collection. What about this is real significant for us?
Well, we have family here, and family is always significant. So on the wall, we have several persons whom many people know. Little Alan Morgan over there grows up, and we get a jewelry store from the Morgan family. And these are the Johnsons of the Johnson family. They were entertainers, they were house painters, but they were very important also in Winona musical history. Well, blind Andrew, he's handicapped. We know very little about him. At the end is Mrs. Seidens, a very famous actress who would come to the old Normal Auditorium, or anyway, she would do Lady Macbeth, and people said her face was one of the most beautiful that had ever come to Winona.
Mary, tell me, you have such a passion for all of these people. It almost sounds like they're your personal friends. Have you just kind of developed this story since you've been working on this project? And tell me what it's meant to you.
Well, yeah, they do become your personal friends. I don't know if that's always good or bad, but you have to get involved in the material. You have to try to learn about each one and retain that information, because that's a step in a process. Scanning them and learning who they are is step one. Then you have to really do history. You know, what does all this mean? What did they contribute, and what are the trends? What does this all mean for Winona County? And the other question is now, after all this, well, where does where did the old settlers go with this? Because it's their collection. And I think maybe the next should be a website. We should try for more identifications and more opportunities to share these wonderful pictures with the public.
Great. I want to thank you for putting it all together and sharing all your wonderful, interesting tidbits that you've learned along the way.
Thank you. And I should thank many other people who have helped me, because I could never have done this alone. I stand on the shoulders of many, many, many people, including people who have made contributions. Rose Cowles giving me, Country Comfort gives me the antique trunks, and Waltz Buick gives me something, and I could go on and on. The college here, my college, and the PSC Union out in New York City, of City University, who gave me the grant money and the sabbatical. Thank you to all those people.
Great. And thank you, too, especially.
Thank you, Joyce.
And thank you for joining us today here at St. Mary's University. Please join me again next week. Till then, enjoy the Spirit of Winona.